Good evening, everybody. I hope you all are doing well and have had a good week. I wanted to just give you an overview of what we'll be going over today. We will be having I wanted to focus more on a general discussion of the brain and behavior content. You all had a really great recorded lecture from Dr. Combs-Orme that pretty much covered everything that I have in the lecture tonight. And so I don't want to, spend all that time kind of regurgitating the same information. I wanted to have more discussion. So we'll do that. And then we'll get into the three group presentations, which I am very excited about, and then we can go ahead and get started with any kind of general course questions. So I was really pleased to see that you all did very well on the first quiz. Really happy about that. Hopefully many of you all are happy with your grades as well. The second quiz was posted earlier today. So as I mentioned, if you have any questions about that quiz or any of the quizzes, I'm here for you. Just please email me and I'll respond as soon as I can. And if there are issues, I'm always kind of refining and revising these quiz questions as issues come up. A lot of times I think that I'm clear, but I am human, and sometimes I'm not so clear. And so what happens is if I get kind of several emails about the same question, I really pay attention to those, and I will do, I think I mentioned this earlier, but just wanted to say it again. I will do an item analysis on any questions that seem to be problematic, and I will look at those based on your feedback, and then potentially if, like the vast majority of you all got them wrong or something like that, I will, and I agree that there was something about it that was an issue on my end, I'll go ahead and throw those out. I haven't had many of those issues on these quizzes, but it does happen, and every cohort is different. So if you have any questions or concerns about the quizzes in general or individual quiz questions, please let me know about that. Just as a reminder, if you could please mute your phones and your laptops and your iPads and all that good stuff. I hear some background noise. That would be really appreciated. Thank you. So that's my thought on the quizzes. Are there any, before I jump into the content for this week, are there any questions about the quizzes or just any general course stuff that doesn't want to wait for office hours after class? You can go ahead and unmute and speak up, or put it in the chat box. Okay. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So I am going to pose a question to you all. So I'm really curious to see how the material this week sort of landed for you kind of differently from last week. So if you, I know we talked a lot about in the first class and last week about kind of the importance of looking at the this content as it relates to social work practice. So I'm curious how you all kind of took that information and ran with it this week. So did you learn anything new this week that you kind of further reinforce, like why we're looking at this for social work practice, or maybe something triggered for something that an area that you're already working in or where you're interning, and kind of have some thoughts that reinforce the importance of this in social work practice? Don't be scared. I know y'all don't want me to call on people, but I'm not scared to call on people.
This is Alora, and I would just like to say that I feel like from last week with this week, how they, last week it kind of lay the foundation for this week. I felt like they have built upon one another, and I really already feel more well-rounded, more educated on the physiology of, how it relates to social work, the being.
That's, thank you for saying that, Alora, because we were really intentional when we were designing this course about which units we had and in what order. And I agree, that was really what we were trying to do, is have each week sort of built on, the previous week and things like that. And then the stress and trauma unit next week, which I'm biased, but that's my favorite unit. I get really jazzed about that unit. It's my favorite one to teach, but it's, that unit really, really builds on the brain and behavior unit. And so all of your knowledge that you're learning this week about kind of the specific brain parts and their functions and all that kind of stuff, you'll be calling on more next week, because we'll start to talk about, well, what does that really look like when things go wrong, or when things aren't or people aren't developing or their development is compromised in some way. So so great thought. Thank you. Are there any other examples that you all can think of, that things that were sort of landing differently for you this week than last week? Even if it's just about the structure, like it was easier to get through the readings or anything like that.
Just to kind of, this is Shelby. Just to kind of build on what Alora said, I really like how this has been structured so far, and I'm really excited about the stress and trauma unit, just because the work that I do now, I work in a child advocacy center, so I see a lot of kids that have gone through trauma, and I kind of already know that the kids that come in and that I see act different based on, stuff that's happened to them, but it's really nice to be able to put that into words and explain it in a way that makes sense to parents and stuff like that. Just to tell them what's happening in their kids' brains is like, it's really cool, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think that's what I'm hoping that you all will find in each of your own way. Thank you for sharing that, Shelby, because I think, not everybody's, my passion is, children's mental health and child trauma and child welfare and things like that. But not everybody's in that lane, so some people are going to be working with older adults. This information is really relevant to older adults too. So it's kind of like, or how does this, like the A study, for example, is really focused on the United States and maybe not so much with immigrant populations. So, is this information the same, or, how does it differ for certain populations that may not be kind of born and raised in the United States? So so I'm curious, and I challenge each of you to figure out, what population are you interested in, and then see how this relates, or maybe even do some of your own research on your end about special populations, homeless individuals, veterans. There's, it really can, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human, but there can be different ways, especially from a policy standpoint about how, or an intervention standpoint about how you might actually use this information. Okay, so what else did you all take away? Were there any kind of concerns about how you were able to move through the material? I heard from my class earlier today that some things weren't kind of lining up as well as they were last week, or anything like that. Any questions or concerns about just kind of getting through the vocabulary and all the readings and the CTE? That was good for most folks. Okay. Some strategy, I'll just go ahead and say this, some strategies that you may want to look at. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but if you're struggling with like kind of, reading 2 or 3 or 5 pages and then being like, what did I just read? What what is this? Maybe try doing your vocabulary list ahead of time before you get into the readings. You may find that the readings are making more sense, even though a lot of the readings will cover the vocab, or you might actually get the vocab definitions from the readings. If you do a little research and see if you can't develop your vocab list beforehand, that might kind of save you some time and help you understand or get more out of the readings. And then sometimes people like to watch the videos first and then get into the readings. Some people like to do the readings and watch the videos, and it kind of reinforces. So, or some people like to read and then video, and then read and then video, and then read and then video. So I think just experimenting with what your process is, and figuring out kind of what works and what you enjoyed, or kind of even just the times of day that you're choosing to read these articles, because I know it is new for a lot of you. So just trying to figure out kind of what your process is, what works best for you, and then kind of sticking with it. So which of course will be different for everybody. So well, any last questions about general course stuff, quizzes, content, future classes? Okay. Just know I am always open to your feedback. I really hope that you all will email me with any thoughts, and especially at the end of the semester, filling out your course evals. I really do take those to heart, and I use them to update my courses each year. So your feedback is really, really important to me. And I'm always looking to make things better. So, okay, so let's dig right in with some of the lecture. And like I said, we're not going to go through all of these. I'm going to share my screen. This over here. Okay, so like I said, I know that you all got a lot of this in the recorded lecture, but I just wanted to kind of touch on this whole idea of synaptogenesis and how we I'm just gonna have to live there. When we're born with 100 billion neurons, we're pretty much kind of born with that hardware, but it's really how the software of our brain, so all of those synaptic connections get developed, that really is different for everybody. So and the Harvard Center for Child Development has come out with some recent research that says that there are about 1 million neural connections that are made every second in our earliest years, which is really profound. So, we've got these 100 billions of neurons, and then they all start kind of talking to each other and migrating and, really, developing. So, when you think about that from a social work practice standpoint, what are some examples that you all can think of where, you might actually have a conversation with a parent about this information, or use this information to kind of enhance or develop a policy or practice just anywhere in the social work arena? Can you all think of any examples, or maybe you've already seen some in your area?
Yeah, I have.
Great, Kenny.
I actually went to undergrad at Belmont in Nashville. So I did one of my field placements at the Hope Clinic, which you might be, some people, if you're in the Nashville area, might be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely saw a lot of that because they did a new moms group there. And a lot of times the women would, sometimes they'd be pregnant, sometimes they would already have their baby, but they talked a lot about, the importance of reading and talking to your baby a lot, which was covered in the material this week too. But I think just that point of that verbal interaction and that touch and making that eye contact is so vital to all that stuff developing like it's supposed to. So that's an example that I can think of.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, so can you or Katie or anybody else kind of jump in, just sort of playing off that example, which is a good one. How would you see the discussion about that kind of that tactile stimulation that you talked about, and having that interaction, either serve and return, or having those interactions with the mom and the infant? How would you sort of explain that or relate that, the importance of that? Like, what is it actually doing to the baby's brain when mom is interacting in that way?
Well, I think a really good way to describe it is using that architecture metaphor, like laying the foundation. I think that's like the perfect way to make it really accessible to people, to explain to them that doing all this stuff is building kind of that groundwork for their future life and, success in school. And I think the architecture metaphor is like the perfect way to describe that to a client, because it's really accessible.
Yeah, and that certainly is what the kind of the research behind all of the frameworks, metaphors, that that's what they found too, is that everybody kind of, from whatever walk of life you're in, you can kind of get that architecture metaphor, and it and for the most part it really does fit. You can kind of say that the foundation is laid in those early years, and then everything is kind of built on top of it. And so for any of you who know, anybody who has ever purchased a home and gone through that home purchase process, that you get an inspection, and if the inspector comes back and says, you've got a crack in the foundation, everybody's eyes get big, and you start kind of walking slowly away and you really don't want anything to do with that house, because that fixing, a crack in the foundation can be fixed. It's not the end of the world, but it's very expensive. It's costly, it's time consuming, and it's a real pain. It's something that just is very, very difficult. So it's not something that people would generally voluntarily take on. So if you kind of apply that same idea to our children, we don't want to walk away from our kids, we can't do that. So, how do we help to kind of bolster, how parents are interacting with their kids, because babies are not born with a manual, and, and every baby is different, even if we did have a manual. So it's kind of like, figuring out, how to, get information in the hands of parents in a way that they can understand, and then further kind of apply and implement some of those principles, to really help their babies, grow and develop optimally. So jumping in a little bit too, I don't want to go over this in too much detail, because we've kind of, I know Dr. Combs-Orme covered this in her lecture, but I wanted to ask you, were there any of these parts of the brain that kind of jumped out at y'all, or you still had kind of questions or concerns about some of the language? I mean, I know many of you have had this before, but some of you, this may be like totally new. Is there anything in here that we need to spend some more time on?
One thing I would like to add about what we were just talking about with the babies and neuron and brain development. I work with a lot of babies that have neonatal abstinence syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
and I have several where we do modeling a lot with the parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so we teach them how to hold their babies and how to bond. And these babies generally, cry a lot and are very fussy. They don't sleep very much. And most of my babies who we can teach the mom and dads to hold them often, skin to skin, all of those things, do very well. But now I've had another baby who the mother and father weren't interested, and just let the baby stay at the hospital while he withdrew from his drugs. And he has not done very well. Since that time, he's been hospitalized again for more than a month, and now he's 6 months old now, and he's not even meeting his milestones for a 4-month-old. So I think it's sad for him, but it's very interesting that I see these other babies in the same condition that with some nurturing and some, love and all these things, they're meeting their milestones now, whereas this other baby currently is not.
You know, who was just speaking?
It's Alicia.
Alicia, absolutely beautiful example. That is kind of, you talk about starting out with, on your resilience scale, talk about starting out with like everything stacked against you. I mean, those little babies have so much. And if you're not familiar with drug-dependent newborns or neonatal abstinence syndrome or NAS, please look it up. There's some fantastic videos, especially Tennessee's done a lot of work in that area. If you're not in Tennessee, you might find some stories from here, but they're so compromised because they've just gotten this, chemical wash and toxin wash, every single day that they've been in their mother's womb, as long as their mother was using even prescribed opiates. I mean, most babies with NAS, or at least have, it's not from illicit, they're not born, it's not from illicit drug use. It's actually from prescribed medications that are used appropriately. So, these medications are just really, really heavy. And, but it's such a great example to show that like these interventions and these policies that we develop based on the latest research are really, really important, because they actually can make a difference. And if you intervene early enough, you can, babies even born with like some of the worst possible, scenarios can grow up and start meeting their milestones even as early as 6 months, like Alicia was saying. So that's a fantastic example, and definitely shows support for a lot of the things that we would advocate for. What are some other examples? I think there was one in the chat that was really good. What are some other examples, whether it's like infants or even older children, where you could say that this sort of fits, like how you would kind of use this knowledge about brain architecture and, and development, how all of that works to work with your clients?
I work for the Department of Children's Services, and we have a lot of foster parents that are really good families, and they have to take different trainings to understand why the children that they're fostering are maybe going through the different behaviors and acting out the way that they do, because they don't really understand what all the trauma does to them. Mm-hmm. And so it takes a lot of training on their part and our part, and also counseling and therapy for the kids. But I think that's a good example too.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. Do they still offer, are you in Tennessee or are you somewhere else?
Yes, Tennessee.
Do you also offer like therapeutic foster care?
Some, yes. Those are like higher level homes. So
okay. So, but everybody gets that training, is what you're saying?
All the foster parents do, yes.
All the foster parents, yeah. Okay, yeah. I was hoping that somebody would bring that up. I think that's a perfect example, because you are working with kids who have these kind of higher needs, and when you think about you think about the brain development, we will really, really, really dive into this, into the trauma piece and the stress piece next week. But just as a preview, when you think about just, you have all this 100 billion neurons, then you've got this, synaptogenesis, which is this whole, neurons that fire together, wire together. And if you think about having a million neural connections, so that's a lot of wiring that's happening over and over and over again from the moment the baby is born and their brain starts to develop, even before they're born. That's a lot of information to undo. So when you think about working with kids, whether you're working with them in a professional setting or, you're a foster parent or working with foster parents, that just knowing that, it's like, hopefully it can help people understand that, you're facing, working with a kid who has really got some cards stacked against them just from a physiological standpoint. It has nothing to do with their worth or their value or anything like that. It's truly how their brain has developed because of their environment, let alone whatever kind of genetic predispositions that they're faced with too. That's kind of, again, about where that fulcrum is. And then if you've got maybe 3 years of abuse and neglect, and then they're not really getting into foster care till they're almost 4, and the brain triples in size in the first 3 years, that's a lot you're not really going to undo it, but there's opportunities that you can have with early interventions and safe and supportive environments that you really can help to, mitigate some of that, increased risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a really good service that we have in Tennessee for children under 3, I think it's 3, is Tennessee Early Intervention Services.
Yeah.
And they can go into the home and work with their developing and teach the parents different things to work with their children. And that, that's really good for younger children. And that, that doesn't have to be a child in foster care that receives that service. It can be any child.
Yeah, and you're right. And it helps in anywhere, in any state. If there are those early intervention services, they can make huge differences for the family, especially with things like detecting developmental delays, speech delays, autism, all of those things that really the trajectory of a child's development so much better when you can intervene early. And Summer, like the comment that you have about the children's trauma, I mean, it's so hard because I think parents, they want the kid, they want to love the kids, they want the kids to be lovable, say that they're bad, but really, I mean, they're, as we learned in the first unit on epigenetics, I mean, a lot of times you're kind of wired, mom's womb has pretty much prepared you to enter a really stressful environment. So you may respond to stress in very different ways than somebody else. It doesn't mean that you're bad or that you've done something wrong. It just means that, you're not necessarily meeting the typical mold that society wants you to. And, there's some things that, we may need to intervene on, like behavior, like impulse control and things like that. But again, even looking at things like impulse control, you can track it all back to, the amygdala and the lack of the, development of the prefrontal cortex, which is our great inhibitor. It's the big, our center of reason, our executive functioning, our higher order functioning, our planning, there, and it's in emotion control, it helps us to process our emotions. And so if that PFC is compromised, as it can be, it's not even fully developed for any children, let alone kids who have experienced trauma, you have to develop those connections, all of our experience, all of that stimuli, like the amygdala in 5-minute video that the doctor talked about in that video, he explains it really well, that the amygdala is this highway that both generates information and processes information in a loop and kind of goes straight back to our PFC. But if our PFC is not fully developed, then it kind of allows that alarm that may happen when we get that stressful, stimuli and, information coming in. Somebody with a raised fist, a raised fist can be somebody who's getting ready to hit you, or it can be somebody who's cheering for, the hockey game. It's like, it can be a lot of different things. But if you've learned that every time, you're little and you've learned that every time there's a raised fist that there's pain involved, you're going to make your brain's going to make an automatic association and develop like basically neural pathways, neural highways, over and over and over and over again. If it happens once, it may get, and it was really traumatic, it may sort of get kind of burned in your brain in a way, but to develop these pathways that are so critical to our development, it really does have to happen over and over and over again. So if you're trying to, make corrections and mitigate, behavior for kids that have experienced trauma, you're going to have to combat millions and millions of neural connections. And it absolutely can be done, but it's not going to be done in one day. and it's not going to be done, you know, overnight or even in a month. It's something that those parents, whether they're biological parents or foster parents or adoptive parents, that, you know, they've got to kind of understand and get on board with. And I'm really happy to hear that DCS is taking it so seriously, you know, to the point that they're really integrating a lot of this information into their trainings. Yes, Whitney, you talked about The Boy Who's Raised as a Dog. We actually used to use that book in this particular course. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot of examples in it, and it is a really great read. Certainly things like The Body Keeps the Score. Vanderkolk is a great. There's so many great books about this particular issue. Okay. So any other questions about specific parts of the brain that you all want to touch on before we move on? Any questions, concerns?
This is Laura. I would like just a further clarification of just the neocortex. You know, like the cortex and neocortex, just.
That's really confusing, but basically it's the same thing.
Okay.
We had questions earlier about that. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. It's kind of like, you know, it's sort of like the prefrontal cortex is part of like the frontal lobe. It's just sort of how you're kind of talking about it. So, you know, cortex and neocortex are, I mean, at least for our purposes, I'm sure that, you know, when you're really diving into things that there may be some other differences, but for our purposes, it's just kind of consider it the same thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I'm sure you're not the only one with that question. Oh goodness. Sorry, my computer is acting up. Okay. All right, so y'all kind of covered this with the parts and the lobes and the hemisphere. You know, these are really kind of the four overarching, you know, parts of the brain. And this is that whole conversation that I know you're familiar with at this point about how the brain develops from, you know, from the bottom up and the inside out. So the things that are closest to our brainstem are more basic functions for survival, and the things that are furthest away from our brainstem are going to be the higher order thinking, the things that really separate us from animals in many ways. You know, humans are really the only ones who can think about thinking or think about reasoning something, or, you know, decision making, planning, all of those kinds of things make really set us apart from animals. So the cerebellum, that's really important with automatic processes, movements. If this is also certainly implicated if you've ever seen somebody who's really intoxicated. They might be stumbling, they might be slurring their speech, they might be getting into a car accident because they have really slow reflexes, and you know, they're driving and they just don't miss the tree because they can't move fast enough. It's because that's, you know, a place where, you know, alcohol is really going to be, you know, it's going to start to affect that area. So this is also important information when you think about, you know, talking about traumatic brain injuries and any, you know, whether it's car accidents, gunshots, wounds from war. There's many different aspects of just having a basic understanding why that may be relevant to you all. That's funny, Ashley. Yeah. So, you know, you never know. You can get information from all kinds of places. It's good to just make sure that, you know, it's correct. You know, and this last piece about any problem in the brain's simpler parts inhibits healthy development of subsequent parts. So very similarly to the way that, you know, we structured this course to, you know, unit 2 builds on unit 1, unit 3 builds on unit 2. You know, we were intentional about that. The brain is doing the exact same thing, you know, very naturally and organically, is kind of developing from its very smallest part to its most complex part. So you all have seen this before. So that kind of, you know, you can kind of see that what's happening at 3 weeks. And this is really, and when you see it even before 3 weeks, it's really just like this little line, this little like pea pod looking thing. And, oops, it's a, it starts from, just something that's almost like, it looks totally insignificant, but it's not. And it absolutely, your full brain, which is, right here at a newborn, this is, you're looking at 100 billion neurons, and they're just waiting to figure out what to do. And it's that environment that's right there, all of that stimuli. Does mom or dad pick me up when I cry? When I'm wet, does somebody change me? Am I getting fed? Are people paying attention to me? Am I warm? Am I cold? All of those things are creating those connections that become so, so important to us. So I think y'all have covered this enough. I did want to ask y'all about the, if anybody can kind of explain this piece here in the middle, this corpus callosum, who can kind of jump in here and tell me about that?
Okay, isn't that just the thing that kind of transfers information from one side of the brain to the other?
Yes, absolutely it is. Why do you think that is important?
The one side of the brain really functions differently, like more logic and things like that, where the other different, correct or no?
I mean, yeah, we like to talk about, right? Actually, my computer cover says that, explains all that. Yeah, so I mean, there are certain parts of that are, but for our purposes, what's significant about, even just looking at this graphic, what is significant about, like where, if there was let's say if there was a stroke or a brain injury here, how might you see that manifesting behaviorally? Just critically thinking about it.
There would be a lack of processing.
In what way?
In a sense of like information would have a hard time transferring to the different areas of the brain. I know I read one article that talked about that the breakdown of the corpus callosum can cause dyslexia in children. And so it just kind of like prevents the flow of information.
Or perhaps it could be like there. Oh, go ahead, Stacy.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say I actually work with somebody who has a 4-year-old, and they figured out when she was 2 that she has, I guess for lack of a better term, an underdeveloped corpus callosum.
Mm-hmm.
And for her daughter, like I know she's gone through a lot of speech therapy and things like that. Her behaviors come out very much in the same way that you would see a child on the autism spectrum. And the fact that she has a lot of sensory issues, her language is not as developed as other kids her age, and things like that. Like her balance is kind of off sometimes. I didn't really ever know anything about this until kind of talking to her and seeing the therapies and things that she's got to go through.
Yes, and Shelby, you're correct about that, among other things. So it's so all of you are exactly right on this. And if you can think about, we're developing these neural pathways. Some of them are like really clear and really strong and really healthy, and they're basically like big tree trunks, and it's just those things are solid because you've had these same, mom picks me up every time I cry, mom picks me up every time I cry, mom picks me up every time I cry, mom is good, life is good, the world is safe. There's all kinds of connections that are made that are emotional, that are physiological, that are biological. But if you've got a disruption here in this particular area, or maybe it's not necessarily a disruption, but maybe it's sort of like your neural pathway kind of looks something like this, it's squiggly, it's not, and maybe that's kind of the example of having the underdeveloped CC is that so maybe the path is there, but it's sort of just kind of thinking of it in simple terms, like maybe there's sort of brambles and, briar, it's like a briar patch, it's like, it's there, it exists, but it's really hard to get through, and it maybe takes longer time to get through it. So you might see some kind of slower processing. So like people, can see, can process information that they hear, but maybe it's just a little bit slower. You also could see things like, if you look at like stroke victims, people who have experienced stroke, depending on where in the brain that stroke is affected. So basically, what was the part of the brain that got deprived, oxygen the most, and so that their neurons really started to die off, and then therefore disrupt those connections. You're going to see those parts to kind of fall off. So that's why a lot of times with stroke victims, you'll see certain levels of paralysis. So maybe it's like they're even like part of their face gets paralyzed, or their right arm gets paralyzed. I had a friend who experienced a traumatic brain injury that was, it was basically the kind of a through and through, but the majority of the damage to her brain was in her kind of frontal, like left frontal lobe area. And so the whole right side of her body was basically paralyzed. She had kind of some movement in her right arm, but like for the most part, it was pretty paralyzed. But then like, her left side and her left arm was extremely, extremely strong. And it was, part of that had to do with the way that all of this kind of crisscrosses, because you can see, like writing right-handed, it's over here in the left lobe, in the left hemisphere, and your hearing, your auditory context over here, that's on the left side. So this is a bird's eye view of the brain, but this is your right. This is physically your left ear, but inside your brain, this is the information being processed here goes to your right ear. So, and then vice versa. So you've got all of these places that, it's so important for the way that it crisscrosses. And then think about the visual cortex. You're going all the way back here in your occipital lobe, and you've got to get all the way, to the front. You've got all these connections that crisscross through the corpus callosum, and then, ultimately, process whatever stimulation you have, kind of coming in through your eyes. And so there's a lot that has to happen, and that goes on with this particular part of your brain. And so it's, kind of knowing what the healthy brain looks like and the typical brain looks like will really help us to understand and analyze and prepare for when there, things go wrong in those specific areas. Are there any other questions? Yes, absolutely, Candace. Yeah, we've learned so much, unfortunately, from orphanages and institutions, and part of this goes back to, and we may get a little bit more into the stress and trauma unit, but going back to the connections piece, that synaptogenesis. When you cry, when you're a little baby and you cry and mom picks you up or somebody picks you up and you get care, that's what gets hardwired. That's what gets developed, because it's over and over and over again. But if you're in an institution or you're in an abusive or neglectful environment, what gets wired is life is not safe. Life is not predictable. I don't know when I'm going to get fed. I don't know when I'm going to get changed. A lot of those babies, like Candace, you were saying, they're not soothed. And so what develops are things get certain areas get overdeveloped and certain areas get underdeveloped. And who can guess what might be one of those overdeveloped areas for those kids who are in neglectful and abusive environments when they're little?
Would that be the amygdala, the fight or flight kind of part of the brain?
Yes, absolutely. And the fight or flight is about a lot more than the amygdala, as we'll talk about next week. But yes, absolutely. The amygdala will, right here, will get, it's a major, it's right there, right there in the middle, the very middle of our brain. It's, and again, the brain develops from the inside out. It's one of our older components in the limbic area of the brain, and it is right there processing all of our survival reflexes. So is it a saber-toothed tiger or is it my cat? It cannot differentiate. It's one of the biggest things about the amygdala that's so important to remember, is it cannot differentiate between real and perceived threat. hopefully you'll remember more things about the amygdala, but please at least remember that one. This freeze, flee, or fight response that the brain, and really it's a very kind of beautiful symphony of neurophysiological processes that happen when we're experiencing stress or trauma. But in our amygdala is right there in the middle of it all, because it's processing that stimuli that's coming in, good or bad. And so when it senses bad, it's on high alert, and a whole cascade of things happen in our bodies, like increased heart rate, increased muscle tension, sweat, nausea, diarrhea. And we'll get way into those things next week. But, that whole process goes on, but it doesn't matter whether it's a real threat or a perceived threat. All of those things are going to happen regardless. So that's absolutely critical for you all to understand entering the social work field, because you are going to be working with people, even yourself and your coworkers may experience this too. I mean, I've worked with bullies before. Bullies are somebody that's really, and I mean, as colleagues, or I mean, people that I, have to work with. I mean, sometimes you're in stressful environments and it doesn't bring out the best in people. So remember this about yourself too. Everybody's got an amygdala, and everybody's amygdala cannot differentiate between real and perceived threat. And so a lot of times people are behaving in ways that are being driven by this kind of automatic physiological process that they may not really be aware of. So whether it's you, yourself, or it's your clients, it can have really interesting and sometimes frightening, consequences for our bodies, for our brains, for how we develop. And a lot of our clients are these, in these vulnerable populations. So there are people who are born into poverty, and poverty equals stress. So poverty equals a lot of these kind of automatic reactions in a lot of ways. Yes, I'm sure that you do see this in a lot of foster children. It's really, really, and sometimes it can be the smallest thing. So just like the doctor talked about in the amygdala, the 5-minute amygdala video, this whole kind of conditioned stimulus response issue is like, think about it. If you smelled something and then you experienced a sensation, good or bad, your brain and then your body are going to associate that smell with whatever that stimuli or sensation is. So you could go anywhere and smell that same smell, and you may get a flood of memories or a flood of a reaction that you're kind of preparing, and you're tensing, and you're getting in that freeze, fight, or flight. You're getting in that stress response system. It's going to start getting activated simply because your brain has been conditioned to that response. And I think that this is really relevant to children's behavior. So when you have a child who's experienced trauma and then they go to school, school is just a cascade of stimulus after stimulus that some are really good and some are really not so good. Just like I kind of talked about that raised fist, that could be your teacher pointing to something on the board. And all of a sudden, your little 8-year-old brain is kind of going into overdrive, and your hippocampus and your ability to learn is just completely offline. It's not relevant to your stress response. It's not needed. You're not trying to process how many teeth the tiger has. Well, maybe you are in that case. But, it gets hyper alert and hyper aware, and, you have this increased heart rate. You have this, sweating, your body, it's a physiological response. And so because you can't perceive whether it's real or not, you're going to have these reactions. And so it can cause all kinds of issues, especially when you have this kind of chronic stress over time. I could talk on and on about this kind of stuff. I feel like I'm repeating myself. So let me stop there. Are there any questions about this before we move on? Again, we're really going to do a deep dive into this piece next week. Okay, so this part is the neurogenesis piece is pretty relevant to, is pretty relevant to the CTE portion, and basically how do you regenerate neurons and connections when something has been damaged. So some of you, I may imagine, may cover that. So I will let's see, I wanted to ask you, y'all have kind of seen all this already. Okay, this is one of my favorite pieces here about the prefrontal cortex, and it's something that you all, most of you all are either almost totally at, over 25 or getting very, very close. And so some of this may be closer to some folks than others, but, think about what you were doing as an adolescent. Think about what you were doing in your teenage years and see if this is true for you. See if, those connections that you had, because remember, this is adolescence. It's like the last sensitive period. Our brain remains plastic. Our brain remains able to learn and process new information. That's what you all are doing here all the time, and what you will continue to do, pretty much for the rest of your life. But in adolescence, it's kind of like the last big push before our prefrontal cortex is fully developed. So can you all think of, and feel free to share if you feel comfortable, any examples about that kind of fit with this use it or lose it principle? So like Ede says, if a teen is doing music or sports or academics, those are the cells and connections that will be hardwired. If they are lying on the couch or playing video games or watching MTV, those are the cells and connections that are going to survive. So you basically can get kind of wired to be a couch potato, or wired to be a sports enthusiast, or wired to, be an academic and read a lot. I'm just curious if any of you all see this as true. Yes, smell is very, very linked to memory. It's in the same part of the brain. Anybody feel comfortable sharing an example?
I know when I was younger, I took a lot of piano lessons, and then once I reached my teen years or high school, I guess I just lost interest and slowly stopped practicing and kind of got lazy. And now at 25, I barely know the notes on the piano. So
they've all been pruned away. They've all been pruned away. That's a good example about, like, if you don't, if you're not going to use it, that's a great example, and figuring out how this is relevant for us can help you figure out how to help your clients figure out how to do this as well. Okay, so we need to go ahead and move on to our group presentations. Are there any questions about any of the slides on this lecture? I feel like y'all had all this already. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so who we have today is Anastasia, Alexandria, Brittany, and Whitney. Do y'all want to go ahead and go? Are y'all ready?
Yeah, sure.
I'm turning the class over to you. It is your turn to teach.
Okay. Oh, I don't want to share my screen. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I can't see myself, so it's kind of awkward. I don't know what kind of button I put here.
I can see you.
Okay. I've got the vocabulary part. I'm not going to go over a lot since we did go over a lot just a second ago.
especially like the parts of the brain, because I feel like we've talked about that a lot. I want to talk about the plasticity. Kind of my take on it was like the ability of the brain to modify itself and adapt to challenges in the environment. And then the two categories, experience expectant and then experience dependent. I found a really cool example for experience expectant. This kind of refers to the integration of environmental stimuli into the normal patterns of development. So I've kind of made myself a little thing, expectant, and the brain kind of expects it. So an example of those would be vision and hearing. So for an example, to kind of get a better idea, is when vision is obstructed in an infant, and they're not able to perceive the expected visual information that the brain needs to make those synapses. Even though the infant started out with acquired synapses to be able to see, they were pruned away because the brain failed to perceive those visual stimuli. So that's kind of that. And then experience dependent refers to additional skills developed over a lifespan that the brain doesn't expect. So this is kind of like when you learn to ride a bicycle or when you learn to drive. I mean, you don't pop out of your mom knowing how to drive or ride a bicycle. So that's kind of something that you're dependent on from somebody else to learn. And then I wanted to talk about the critical period of development versus the sensitive period of development. For the critical period, this is like the maturational stage, and a lot of people think this is from the first 3 years in the lifespan of an organism, during which the nervous system is especially sensitive to certain environmental stimuli. So this is the period that is most critical. And then like the sensitive period, it's kind of a window of opportunity for where you can have experiences that make a greater impact on certain areas of the brain. So during sensitive periods, this is where the brain is most likely to strengthen important connections, and this is where they eliminate the unneeded ones in the specific parts of the brain. And that's kind of the vocabulary I've got. Who wants to go next as far after the vocabulary?
I can go.
Okay.
So this is, I actually go by Stacy, but it's Anastasia. So I was basically going to cover the concepts, and it's kind of already been, I was a little confused, and we sent some emails back and forth just because I feel like, answering the prompt for the CFTM, Lord, I've worked a lot, for the CTE, plus the vocabulary like she just went over, kind of does cover the concept. And I just got kicked out of my tablet. Hang on one second. What I was going to say actually has already been touched on a lot tonight. As far as like the experience expectant and this experience dependent, and the use it or lose it, I actually was going to bring up piano as well. When I was really little, I took about 8 years of piano lessons, and now I can sit down and I can tell you what the notes are, but if you ask me to read any music, I'm going to look like an idiot. And with language, I went to private school when I was really young, and we learned French and German and Italian, and I can speak very little French now because I haven't had to do that. And I'm glad you touched on the vision thing as well. My goddaughter was actually born with cataracts, and so for the first 6 months of her life, she couldn't see anything. And then she had a surgery, and like they had to remove the lenses in the surgery, and she has, for being born and them saying she's never going to see again, to seeing specialists and kind of her brain like adapting to no longer having those lenses that were clouded anymore. She's got near perfect vision now. So I thought it was really cool that both of those things were brought up. But as far as like covering the concepts, I think it's really been covered with our discussion tonight and with the vocabulary that she went ahead and presented.
So how would you all apply this to the specific prompt? So like, how would you explain, as it relates to the 17-year-old with a traumatic brain injury and how would you apply some of those concepts and vocabulary to that? Or was that what the next people were going to talk about?
Yeah, that's what I was going to talk
Okay.
about.
Okay, sorry. Stealing your thunder. Is this Brittany?
This is Whitney.
Whitney, okay. Thanks. If you could introduce yourselves, I can't always see your names on the screen. That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm Whitney Johnson. I was just going to take what Alex and Stacy had talked about with the vocab and the concepts and apply that to the CTE question, which was the 17-year-old boy who'd gotten in the car accident and had the brain injury. And so with that family, I would just really, as the social worker, want to focus on explaining neuroplasticity to them and just like communicating that the brain is plastic, you know, like it does find new ways to do things after an event like that. And also I'd want to explain neurogenesis and explain that even though we're born with a lot of what we're going to have our whole lives, we can grow new neurons. And I think that just communicating that would maybe kind of instill hope in the family that this isn't permanent. Like the brain is built to rewire. And I'd also want to mention, because I feel like if it went untalked about, it could be dangerous, potentially that the number one psychological complaint after a traumatic brain injury is depression. And I feel like just keeping that open communication with the family would maybe kind of reduce any stigma that could be around it and make the son feel open to communicate that, because especially during the first year, that's when they're more likely to experience that. And suicide rates are, I think it was like 2.2 to 4 times higher for those who have suffered a brain injury. So I would just make all that known to the family, and I think just keeping it open with them would just help with communication, and just explaining all that would hopefully give them a little bit of hope. Brittany, I'll turn it over to you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I had the discussion question, and we talked about, like, as social workers with limited knowledge of the situation, like if we didn't have this background research that we've been studying this week and things, like how would we go about approaching this topic with the parents, and like what kind of research would we do and things? Like what was people's suggestions? Are you muted? No.
Okay, class, that's a really good question. Does anybody venture a guess about what you all would do? And especially it kind of applies to sort of furthering, kind of continuing education and furthering your knowledge as well, just as you move forward, because we're certainly not covering the be all end all of everything in this course. Y'all have any ideas about once you no longer have access to the UTK libraries, what you all are going to do?
Maybe if you speak to someone that has experienced that and seen kind of what they did to minimize the issues or to help with their recovery.
I think another good idea could be, the social worker in the scenario is working at a brain injury or at a rehabilitation center. So there probably are lots of doctors or, someone who might know more than you would. So I think that kind of highlights the importance and the great opportunity that comes with working on a team setting. And as a social worker, you kind of are in this great place where you can maybe help translate some of the things that like a neuroscientist might say to a family. So I think tapping into your resources that are just around you, your other colleagues and your teammates, is a really good way to further your education.
Great. Those sound like good ideas. Definitely always relying on your network is really important. I think that's what people rely on social workers a lot, to have that long list of resources available. Great. Okay. Good job. Okay. Let's move on quickly to group 2B. So Katie, Ashley, Rochelle, and Amber.
So we focus more on the CTE and like what we would do with the family. And one of the prompts was to explain what the function of the PFC was. And so the PFC is part of the frontal cerebral cortex, and that's more responsible for thinking, perceiving, producing, and understanding language. And this is what we would explain to the family in this situation. So there's many parts of the frontal cortex, such as the, I can't say this word, amygdala, I can't say that word, and the hippocampus. And so what the hippocampus is, it's more made up of emotions, memory, and the autonomic nervous system. So the prefrontal cortex is in front of the frontal cerebral cortex, which is where our client was injured. So, and that's their main function of that is just planning and personality development. And so just explaining that and how that works to the family in a simple language for them to understand is very important. And there are 5 main functions that I've researched of the PFC. And a lot of them, it was our executive function. So what that means is like working memory, flexibility, delayed responding, and active problem solving. And then it's also with memory, intelligent language, and visual search and gaze control. And it helps for us to remember, solve problems, keep our vision straight, and many other aspects. And I'll hand it over to Amber.
Due to the injury in the prefrontal cortex, he's most likely going to suffer from memory loss and also the loss of many basic skills such as like the organization and planning and his mood control even. This would impact his ability to learn and retain information if he were to go back to school, as well as gathering his thoughts and being able to organize them to complete the assignments. Since his brain was still forming at this point, he would still be gaining white matter and losing gray matter. The white matter is so important because it connects the various areas of gray matter and transports those nerve impulses between the neurons. However, due to this injury, this can stop that brain growth and prevent more white matter from forming. His behavior will be affected in many ways, and he may not be able to know how to control those moods, just based on the extent of the damage. And, one thing that I would explain to the parents is you may not know how he's going to react to the different stimuli until he's faced with that stimuli, and his reactions could vary from time to time depending on those certain triggers. So Ashley's going to go into a little bit more depth on that as well.
Hi. So Amber and I accidentally did the same thing. So I don't want to say everything that she said, but I will reiterate some points. Damage to the prefrontal cortex also means that there's damage to his emotional control and mood regulation. A guy, he may have been nice and helpful. The damage to the PFC would mean that he wouldn't recognize some social cues, or he would have issues regulating his mood. So some things would anger him and he would have a hard time trying to back into the question you asked at the beginning of class, like how we felt about this particular module. And I have a cousin who was involved in a head-on collision with an 18-wheeler. And she suffered a very traumatic brain injury. And, you know, prior to the accident, she was very athletic. She was very intelligent. She was actually in school at Arkansas State. But after the accident was over, after the accident happened, she had to basically learn everything, how to sit up, how to talk, how to walk, how to do things on her own. And I knew her after the accident. I never knew how she was before the accident. So the person that I see is who she's always been. And I always wondered, why would she get so angry if something didn't go the way that she wanted it to? Why would she get so frustrated, or why would she say very inappropriate things? So reading over all of the lecture notes and the videos really helped me put it into perspective. And I was able to somewhat explain to my aunt, you know, why she is the way that she is, because at the time of the accident, which was maybe 30 years ago, they didn't have social workers who could explain. I mean, they had the doctors who explained it, but they were speaking in medical jargon that, you know, doesn't make sense to people who don't know the terminology. So definitely reading this information, applying it to real life, helped me explain to my aunt, you know, she's not doing this to be mean or because she's a grouch. She literally cannot help it.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Rochelle?
Yes. Sorry, that was really loud. So I was my part in this was like putting all of what they said into perspective. So I kind of really like to put myself into the client's shoes. And in this case, you have like a senior in high school who is probably like looking forward to graduation and doing the next big thing, like going to college and all of that. And then he gets into this accident, and all of a sudden he's dealing with things that he never thought he was going to be having to address in his senior year. And with that and everything that he is working through as far as like changes in behavior and just all these like feelings of confusion and adjusting to his new life, he could be, sorry, I'm like all over the place. He could be having like a lot of difficulty retaining information, especially with the injury to his prefrontal cortex, and he could feel like really inadequate in comparison to his peers. But also depression and anxiety are higher risks in victims of TBI than other individuals. And so with as brutal as high school is, you take like all of these factors of that he's not really quote unquote himself as he was before the accident, and it's not that he won't ever be who he was. It could bring out like behaviors that he's never had to deal with before. Like he could have been a really cool, calm guy, and his peers could have annoyed him, but he could just brush it off. But then you have like these triggers that could just make him snap. And so it's kind of like adjusting back to that environment and all these like frustrations. And I can't imagine how frustrating that must be, that his school is really going to have to learn how to address these things. And because school is going to be a lot more difficult than it was prior, and his friend group can change as well. And so his teachers should really not necessarily treat him like blatantly different than his peers, but also kind of understand where he's coming from and just adjusting, helping him have as smooth of a transition, and as he's like relearning and trying to figure out who he is in this time period that's already so sensitive to kids who don't have brain injuries. So that kind of leads me into our discussion question. It's how should schools address the issue of TBI as it pertains to students immersing back into the environment?
Good question, class.
So,
what do you think about that?
I remember when I was in high school years ago, we had a girl, she was on the cheer team, and she fell from the top of their structure or whatever. And so she had like a serious concussion. She couldn't even spell her own name. And so when she came back to high school, after she had gone through, basic therapies that help her get reoriented, the school would give her extended time periods to complete assignments. And she got similar to like what IEP students have when they like have speech impediments where they don't have to give speeches. She didn't have to do anything in front of the class. And so they kind of gave her more time to take tests and kind of accommodated her to let her be a normal student and sit in the class. But when it came to the turning in assignments and that stuff, she had special accommodations there that allowed her to still be in school and participate, but work at her own pace.
I have an additional question, if the team would permit me to ask another discussion question.
Of course.
What do you all think? I think it's a really important point to consider is like, what are his environment as in high school is his school. So that's really important, but so is his home. So what are some of the solutions for kind of helping to create a supportive environment at home? What would that look like, do you think?
I think in-home services would be really good and be beneficial for the entire family. It would kind of be like a middle person for them to all discuss their frustrations with, and for someone to maybe give them a plan or help them get a plan together so that he can adapt to the environment and to school and everything around him.
Yeah, I think that's really good, because I think the articles, really showcase that, there are all these risks. And anytime that we talk about risk, even like with ACEs or trauma or any other level of risk factors, we always want to help instill that hope and help people figure out, what do they have control over and what do they not have control over. So figuring out and working one-on-one with those parents to figure out, okay, well, what are the strengths that you all have? Is there good family cohesion? Do you have access to resources? Do you have access to good nutrition? Because his brain really is still developing. So during that whole kind of rewiring and healing process, all of those safe and supportive environments that are going to help him deal with those kind of potential mood regulations or mood changes, and how to help regulate those can help to mitigate some of those risks. So I think, whether that's in-home services or counseling or social work services, whatever that may look like for the family will be important. Okay, good job.
The school can be involved in that too, and they can all kind of be on the same page.
That would be ideal, because then you can create that consistency from home to school. That's excellent. That's a really good point. Thank you. Okay, Team B. Moving on, we have just 11 minutes left, so I want to make sure the last group has a chance to go. So Beth, Brittany, Tiffany, and Alicia. And some of you may have not seen the button that says start video on your bottom left, but that for some people, I know you can't see the video, so when you're talking and stuff, that would be great if you could try to click that so we can see you too.
All right, I'll begin. My group, this is Tiffany. My group split it up into 4, and I'm going to be the one to explain the function of the PFC. So most of the brain's complex functions are in the front of the brain, and the part of the brain our client injured was the prefrontal cortex, which sits right behind the forehead. The cortex controls thinking and voluntary movements, while the frontal lobe is associated with reasoning, planning, parts of speech, movement, emotions, and problem solving. The prefrontal cortex itself controls planning, working memory, organization, and moods. And of course, with his age, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet, since it's the last part of the brain to develop. And it can be found to be growing again just before puberty and continue to grow into young adulthood. As the prefrontal cortex matures, teenagers can reason better, develop more control over impulses, and make judgment better. And I will now let Alicia explain what possible behavioral changes that may occur with this injury.
Alicia, is your mic working?
Nope, but it is not.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Great. So the way I wrote mine was kind of like I'm just having a conversation with the parents. And so I said, since the prefrontal cortex involves mood regulation, there are some behavioral changes that you as his parents need to be aware of. Depending on the severity of the injury, he may experience depression, anxiety, irritability, and aggression. And in regard to depressive behavioral symptoms, he could have sadness, negativity, loss of pleasure in things he used to enjoy, feeling of hopelessness, suicidal thoughts, and even psychosis. An anxiety disorder may also manifest in the form of panic or different phobias, which could cause ongoing feelings of apprehension and dread. He could have post-traumatic stress disorder from the injury itself, which can cause him to have feelings of anxiety. He could start experiencing the trauma over and over. He could avoid certain things or become hypervigilant due to the trauma that happened to him. And then I said also to the parents, his behavior could also change in regard to emotional regulation. He may become irritable very easy or aggressive, which may not be something they've ever dealt with this particular child, with their son. And I would also advise the parents, them to be mindful of the risk of suicidal ideations and also suicide attempts. And then depending on the severity of the injury in regard to that. And so now I'll let Beth explain how this may affect his school functioning.
Hi, this is Beth. Can you hear me okay? Okay. The patient was wondering about how this would affect him going to school. So basically, I would explain that it all depends on the severity of the injury, whether it be mild, moderate, or severe, and the severity of the symptoms. A few main symptoms that might impact his success in school could be memory impairment, difficulty with attention, anxiety, and emotional excitability and irritability. If you were to experience any of those symptoms, it could very well make it very difficult for him to focus, and it could also affect his social life. My suggestion to the parents and to the 17-year-old would be to work closely and keep the lines of communication open with the school, teachers, guidance counselor, even the doctor, getting the doctor involved and just getting as many people involved in talking about, how things are going and following up. Regarding his abilities, maybe on a weekly basis, or if it needs to be sooner, then that's fine. But his abilities, meaning physically, mentally, like his behavior, his mood, his affect, and cognitively. A quick example of a similar situation that I might reference, but it goes back to, a video we watched or that we were supposed to watch this week regarding brain trauma in sports, and a 17-year-old, Reed Snyderman, who received a concussion after falling when he was skiing. And he described feeling afterwards as bewildered, really out of it, couldn't maintain a thought, and even things something that used to be easy to him, like math, was not. He couldn't do it. And I felt that through the conversations with his coach and his parents, that helped in his recovery. He said it was very scary, and I think that he seemed very open about it. I think obviously there's going to be, everyone's going to be different, and the 17-year-old, not every 17-year-old is going to be as talkative about what's going on with them. So I think probing them and just keeping an eye on that is very important. So now I will let Brittany talk about how this could affect his future.
All right, I'm Brittany. So I focused on how the PFC injury will affect our client's future. So depending or severe can affect how it will impact his future. As stated in one of the articles, the majority of traumatic brain injuries are mild, and people with mild TBIs have noted symptoms of headaches, dizziness, mental cloudiness, brief loss of consciousness, post-traumatic amnesia. So these symptoms usually diminish with time, and they can dramatically diminish after a year after the injury. With more moderate to severe TBIs, you might have greater consequences later on in life, such as dementia, Parkinson's disease, and endocrine disorders. So assuming that this client's TBI is mild, the most common complaint is depression. So studies have showed that there's a higher risk of, or a higher rate of depression in the first year following the TBI, but the risk for depression can last for years after the injury. Anxiety and irritability are also common in mild TBI cases, but the good news is that our client is 17 years old, which means that his prefrontal cortex is still developing and will continue to develop into his 20s. The other good news is that the brain, especially adolescent brains, is malleable and capable of learning new things and recovering from this injury. So we kind of already discussed this question, but I'll put it out there again. So with all of this information being said, what do you guys think is the best treatment plan to ensure that this client recovers as much as possible from this injury?
You know, like we talked about earlier, just getting everybody involved and everybody on the same page. You know, that way everybody can support him and promote his.
Amber, you froze. We can't hear you. Could somebody else jump in? Hey, sorry about that. Sorry about that. That was my internet. I thought Amber froze, and I guess I froze.
Okay. No, just what I was saying was just getting everybody on the same page so that, you know, he can get the support that he needs from all angles.
I think another good thing would also be maybe talking to someone who'd experienced something similar. Not just necessarily like group therapy, but maybe someone older or even around the same age that had gone through something similar. He would kind of be able to relate to them better.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. What else?
I definitely think that's good for the family too. You know, maybe they have other parents or individuals that would be a good source of support for them as well.
Oh yeah, because I'm sure they have a lot of the same questions and concerns that possibly the other parents had, and sometimes you can just relate to a parent better than you can even a social worker or a stranger coming in your house trying to help. Sometimes you just take the information a little bit better when it's someone else.
Yes.
I was going to add that I know a lot of times for especially 17-year-olds, some of their biggest the people that influence them the most are their friends. And I know 17-year-olds, as we have talked about, are always kind of have a tendency to take more risk-taking behaviors. And so just ensuring that the people close to him, his friends, and those kind of people also were educated about the brain injury. I think that's probably important as well, because he's probably more likely to take advice from those people than his parents.
Yeah, you know, those are all excellent examples. And I think I think it was Ashley that said, you know, in the chat that like having a well-rounded support system is critical. And I think you all are kind of touching on those different pieces. And so, you know, what does that actually mean? So to have a support system and having that peer-to-peer interaction will be critical, because exactly like you're saying, you know, the influence of his friends is really important. And especially if his behavior starts to change, his friend group may change. So that could be a positive thing, or that could be a not so positive thing. He may have been a not risk-taking person before, and then kind of starts to be a little more reactive and have more aggression and things like that. Maybe might kind of start kind of dipping in, kind of leaning into more risk-taking behavior. So kind of keeping an eye out for all of that and supporting the parents, providing that consistency even like I said, good nutrition is all really important. So great intervention, great presentation, everybody. Really appreciate how organized that was. Okay, so that is that concludes our presentation portion and our class. So before I jump into office hours and stop the recording, are there any other questions or comments to add to the discussion tonight?
I will say that we tend to look at things from a strengths-based approach, and it would be very interesting to look at it from an approach where there's a lack of resources and a lack of stability in the home. What if it's a single mom and she can't meet all of his needs and can't get him to his appointments? You know, that may change the entire realm and the way that he recovers.
Mm-hmm. And that's absolutely right. And that's one of the key reasons that the social work perspective is really the systems perspective in that person and environment, is you can't assume all things for all people. So really meeting that client where they are, meeting that family, the 17-year-old, his parents, or if it was a single parent, that is so important to take all of that into consideration, because it really can make a big difference. And one of the things with brain injuries is, you really are going to look at, instilling hope, especially in those early days and weeks and months, because they have a long healing road ahead. So, that rewiring that the brain is going to organically do is going to take at least a year. So what they look like in month 2 post-accident is going to be very different than month 8, is going to be different than month 15. So depending on where you are coming into interaction with that client system, your intervention plan, your treatment plan may be very different. So I was really impressed with how you all were able to articulate those different examples of, what were those risk factors and what are some of those potential things that you can do to help mitigate those, especially keeping in mind kind of, how old that person is. So what would that brain injury look like if they were 12 or if they were 35? So again, knowing kind of where they are in their developmental process will be really important. Okay, any other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and I will be on here until 7:30 if you all have any one-on-one questions that you have or anything like that. And I hope you all have a great week, and email me with any questions. Good night.